My name is Rachel Hollis, and I was 32 years old the morning I sat in a windowless conference room on the 14th floor of a building in downtown Denver and watched my parents discover that the man they had lied about for 20 years had never forgotten me for a single day. The room smelled like printer paper and old coffee. 6 of us at that table. My parents, Gary and Sandra, sat directly across from me. Gary in a button-down shirt he'd pressed that morning. Sandra in the pearl earrings she reserved for situations where she wanted people to take her seriously. Their attorney, a heavy-set man named Briggs, had a yellow legal pad open in front of him. Douglas Webb, my grandfather Harold's estate attorney, sat at the head of the table. And I sat beside my own attorney, Diana Torres, with a manila envelope in front of me that I hadn't touched yet. Gary looked calm. That was the thing I noticed first. He looked calm because he was certain he knew how this ended. He didn't. Douglas Webb cleared his throat and opened the will. He read the date of execution, 8 months before Harold died, when Harold had 3 clean neurological evaluations on file and a mind that worked better than most people half his age. Then he read the figures, the estate, $40 million. Gary and Sandra, 0. Rachel Hollis, primary beneficiary, in full. I watched Gary's jaw go loose, just for a second, just the smallest fracture in that pressed shirt confidence. Sandra put her hand over her mouth. Briggs stopped writing, and I sat very still, because I had known this was coming for 3 weeks. I had read every letter. I had reviewed every piece of evidence Harold had spent 22 years carefully, deliberately preserving. What my parents did not know, what they could not have known, was that there was a second section to the will, and that section was going to say their names. That is where this story ends. Let me take you back to where it begins. Welcome to Betrayal House. If you are new here, this channel tells one specific kind of story. The people who got overlooked, underestimated, and quietly cut out, and then watch the truth come home. I'm so glad you're here. If it's your first time, hit subscribe right now and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss the next one. And if something about this story already feels familiar, if you've ever been told you weren't loved by someone who actually loved you most, drop a comment right now. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is. I read every single one. Now, let me go back to the beginning. 20 years before that conference room, I was 12 years old, and I was being told, for what felt like the 100th time, that my grandfather Harold just wasn't a kid person. My father Gary was the one who said it most. Not with cruelty. That was the thing that made it so effective. He said it the way you'd explain a fact about weather or geography. The mountains are west. The sky is blue. Harold just doesn't really connect with kids, Rachel. It's not about you. It's just how he is. My mother Sandra would nod. Sometimes she would add in a softer voice, "He loves you in his way. He just doesn't always know how to show it." As if that was a complete thought. As if in his way was a category of love that explained everything and required no further examination. I grew up in a house in suburban Denver where Harold existed on the far edges of our family life. A figure in photographs, a name mentioned in passing, a voice I heard occasionally when my parents called him, and I was allowed briefly to say hello before the phone was passed back. He lived in Grand Junction, 2.5 hours west. My parents drove to see him several times a year. I was not often in the car. There were always reasons. "You have a school project this weekend, Rachel. It's a short trip. You'd be bored." Harold doesn't really talk much when people come. It's not fun for kids. The excuses were smooth and plentiful, and they came from both of them with the kind of easy consistency that you only get from something practiced. I internalized all of it. That is what children do with consistent information. They absorb it, categorize it, make it part of the structure they use to understand the world. By the time I was 10, I had a fully built mental model of Harold. Difficult, distant, a man who tolerated family visits but didn't particularly enjoy them, and who definitely did not have much interest in me specifically. I wasn't angry about it. I just understood it as a fact. The way I understood that our street flooded in heavy rain, and that Gary didn't like mushrooms, and that some people were just not meant to be close to you. Harold sent birthday cards every year. They came reliably, right on time. White envelope, first-class stamp, his handwriting on the front, a Grand Junction return address. Inside was a check and a few lines. "Happy birthday, Rachel. Hope this year is a good one. Love, Grandpa Harold." My mother would hand me the card when it arrived, and Gary would say, "See, he does think about you. He remembers every year." That was supposed to be the evidence of his love. That was supposed to be enough. I didn't know, at 12, that the card I was holding wasn't the only thing Harold had sent. I didn't know about the letters. There was one Thanksgiving when I was 12, maybe the week after my birthday, when we drove out to Grand Junction as a family. Harold's house was a wide, single-story house on a quiet street, with a wood fence and a garden Sandra always admired. It smelled inside of wood smoke and something rich coming from the kitchen, and there was a low fire going. And I remember sitting on a footstool near the fireplace while the adults talked at the dining table. Harold came and sat near me. He didn't say much at first. He was a quiet man, tall with gray at his temples and broad hands that looked like they had worked hard for a long time. He had something in his breast pocket, a small round shape beneath the fabric. I don't know why I kept looking at it. I was 12, but I kept looking. At some point during the evening he noticed me looking, and he reached into his pocket and pulled it out. A pocket watch, old brass, with a small dent near the clasp, the kind of dent that comes from decades of use rather than carelessness. The kind of object that has a history attached to it. "You want to see how it works?" he said. He started to open the cover. He showed me the mechanism, the way the case clicked, the tiny movement of the gears when you pressed the stem, the sound it made, which was softer than I expected. I leaned in. I was genuinely interested. And then I felt Gary's hand land on my shoulder from behind. "She doesn't care about that, Dad," Gary said. "She's a kid. You know how kids are." Harold's expression didn't change. He closed the watch. He put it back in his breast pocket and his hand rested on his knee, and he looked somewhere past me, out toward the window. I didn't see him hold it out to anyone else that night. I think about that moment now more than almost any other single memory I have from my childhood. Not because of the watch, because of what Harold was actually doing. He wasn't just showing me a mechanism. He was opening a door. He was saying, "Come in." And Gary closed it with one sentence, so smoothly and so efficiently that I didn't register it as a closing. I thought Harold had simply put the watch away. I thought he'd lost interest. That was how it worked in my family. Not with cruelty. With subtraction. When Gary and Sandra made the trips to Harold's house without me, I went to the public library 2 blocks from our house and stayed until closing. I read everything. History, biology, mysteries, whatever was on the new release shelf. The librarian there, a woman named Mrs. Okonkwo who wore reading glasses on a beaded chain around her neck, knew my name by the time I was 10. She let me place holds on books before they were returned. When it was cold and they were close to locking up, she let me sit in the back room to finish my chapter. She never made me feel like I was inconveniencing anyone. I wanted to be her when I grew up. What I didn't understand at the time was that she was also teaching me something about how information works. Librarians understand, in a way most people don't, that things do not disappear just because someone moves them out of sight. They wait. I was not the kind of daughter my parents expected to amount to much. I need to say that clearly, because it matters enormously for what comes later. I was quiet. Methodical. I wore my hair natural, long, dense coils that I never flat-ironed regardless of what Sandra suggested. I chose comfortable clothes over fashionable ones. I chose a state school over the expensive college Gary thought I should attend, which was interesting since Gary was not offering to pay for either. I found my own money. A partial merit scholarship through the State Library Association. I found the application myself, wrote the essay myself, drove myself to the interview. Gary's reaction when I told him, "You're going to school to learn how to shelve books?" "Sandra, it's a respectable profession, Gary." "Gary, I'm just saying she could aim higher. I aimed exactly where I wanted." I graduated with a degree in library science and information studies and got a job at an elementary school in Denver's Westwood neighborhood. The school was chronically underfunded. The library, if you could call it that, was 3 mismatched bookshelves crammed into a converted storage room that still had the original shelving brackets on the walls from when it stored custodial supplies. The books were mostly donations, outdated encyclopedias, water-damaged paperbacks, reading-level texts from 2 curriculum cycles ago. I wrote my first grant within 60 days of starting. By the end of my second year, I had secured enough funding to gut the room and rebuild it properly. New shelves, acoustic tile on the ceiling, a reading corner with actual carpet and low bookshelves kids could reach themselves, a Spanish language section that represented the 32% of our students who came from Spanish-speaking homes, a catalog system the teachers could actually search, computers. The principal cried at the ribbon cutting. I didn't think it was remarkable. I thought I was doing my job. But Gary and Sandra came to see it once, on a visit, and Gary walked through the room with that look on his face, the slight squint, the head tilt, the look he reserved for things that impressed him, but that he had already decided were not worth upgrading his assessment of. He said, "So you basically just got other people to fund your project?" I said, "Yes, Gary. That's called a grant. I kept every grant application I wrote in a filing cabinet in my bedroom, every document, every contract, every letter of support. I kept lease agreements, tax returns, the original copies of every professional correspondence I ever sent." My ex-husband Eli had found this mildly amusing. He'd stand in the doorway of our bedroom and look at the cabinet and say, "What exactly are you preparing for, Rachel?" I didn't have a good answer. I just kept things. I kept things the way some people keep photographs, not obsessively, not anxiously, but with the quiet certainty that someday someone would need to know something actually happened. I was 32, and I had a small apartment I loved, a job I believed in, and a life that was entirely mine. My marriage to Eli had ended amicably when I was 26. He wanted things I didn't: a house with a yard, children before 30, a life that moved faster and louder than the one I was building. We parted without damage. I kept the apartment and the bookshelves. He kept the couch. My parents came to Denver occasionally. At Christmas, they visited, and Gary would survey my apartment and wait for me to announce something he could be proud of. When nothing was announced, he'd say something like, "Any promotions coming? Any plans to move into administration?" As if the library wasn't enough. As if caring for children's access to books was a station, not a destination. One Christmas, Gary mentioned Harold in passing. He said Harold was getting older, still sharp, but quieter. And then he said something that I carried with me even though I buried it quickly. He said, "He asks about you, you know." I looked up. By that point, I had long since accepted the narrative. Harold was distant. Harold was difficult. Harold cared in his way, which meant he didn't reach out, which meant our relationship was what it was, which meant I had processed the loss of it and moved on the way you move on from things that are never explained to you. Quietly, facing forward, telling yourself this is just how some families are. So when Gary said he asks about you, something shifted. I said, "He does?" Gary's expression recalibrated in under a second. He said, "In his way. He's just getting old, Rachel. Don't read into it." I didn't. But I didn't forget it. The year before Harold died, Gary and Sandra made several trips to Grand Junction that they mentioned only in passing. Harold's health was declining, Gary said. Nothing specific, just age. Sandra would say, "We're keeping an eye on things. You don't need to worry about it, Rachel. I had a full life. I trusted them to handle what needed handling." What I did not know was that Harold had stopped trusting them entirely. In April of that year, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. I let it go to voicemail. The message was brief. "My name is Douglas Webb. I am an attorney in Grand Junction. I've been retained by your grandfather, Harold Hollis. Please call me back at your earliest convenience." I called Gary first. I don't know why. Reflex, maybe. Habit. 15 years of being taught that Gary was the one who managed Harold, who understood Harold, who knew how these things worked. Gary said, "Yeah, Harold has been doing some estate planning. Nothing major. You don't need to get involved in that." I said, "He left me a voicemail." Gary said, "I know. I spoke with Webb already. It's just standard paperwork. I'll handle it." I didn't call Webb back. I know now that was the third time Gary redirected my path to Harold. I know now that Webb had been trying to reach me for nearly a year. Harold died on a Tuesday in October. Sandra texted me. 2 sentences. Dad passed this morning. Service is Wednesday. Not a phone call. Not even a question of whether I needed help getting there. 2 sentences. I sat with that text for a long time before I booked a flight. The house where my parents live in Fort Collins is a wide beige colonial with a 2-car garage and a flower bed Sandra maintains with the focus most people reserve for their actual careers. I arrived the afternoon before the funeral and found 2 unfamiliar cars in the driveway. Inside, there was a man I had never seen before standing in the living room with a briefcase. He was younger than I expected. Early 40s, wire-rimmed glasses, the posture of someone working hard to project calm under real pressure. Gary and Sandra were on the far side of the room, and the 3 of them had clearly been in the middle of something that stopped the moment I walked in. Gary turned, and for just a half second, just the smallest fraction of it, something moved across his face. Then it was gone. The man with the briefcase turned to me. "Miss Rachel Hollis?" "Yes." "I'm Douglas Webb. I've been trying to reach you for 3 days." Gary stepped forward. "She doesn't need to be here for this." Douglas Webb looked at Gary with the flattest professional expression I have ever seen in my life. Then he turned back to me. "Your grandfather left specific instructions. He wrote you a personal letter, sealed, with your name on the front. He asked that it be delivered to you in person at the first available opportunity." He opened his briefcase. He removed an envelope. White, slightly aged at the edges, with my name written on the front, in a handwriting I had only ever seen on birthday cards. Gary's hand shot out. "That is not—" "Sir." Webb's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "If you touch that letter, I will call the police. This is legally your daughter's property." The room went very quiet. I took the envelope. Sandra was pressing her fingers to the corners of her eyes. Gary stood with his hands at his sides, very still. And I was holding a letter from my dead grandfather, holding it in both hands, feeling the slight give of the paper that smelled faintly of the wood smoke I associated with Harold's house in Grand Junction. I put it in my bag. Webb explained the formal will reading scheduled in 10 days. He also mentioned a second sealed document Harold had deposited with his office 2 years prior, to be opened only in my presence, with my attorney present. He handed me his card. I did not look at my parents on the way out. I checked into a hotel that night. I sat on the edge of the bed with the overhead light on and my bag on the floor, and I took out the envelope. Harold's handwriting on the front. My name. Careful, deliberate letters. The handwriting of someone who understood that this document would outlast the moment it was written. I opened it. He started with my name. "Rachel, I want to begin by telling you something I should have found a way to make sure you heard years ago. I have never stopped loving you. Not for 1 day. Not for 1 hour." He wrote that he knew the story I had been told. He wrote that he had spent 15 years figuring out exactly how that story had been built and by whom. He apologized for trusting the wrong people to be the bridge between them. He wrote about the attempts he had made to reach me. Letters that were never answered. Phone calls where Gary told him I was unavailable. A visit he had attempted when I was 19, driving to Denver without telling anyone. Gary meeting him at the door and saying Rachel isn't home, she's at school, she'll call you. She never called, because nobody told her. He wrote about the private investigator, a woman named Carla Santos, whom he had retained in 2019. It took Carla 3 months. What she brought back was a documented pattern. Letters sent to my parents' Fort Collins address, intercepted before they ever reached me. A cashier's check for $5,000 Harold had sent for my 18th birthday, endorsed and cashed, not by Rachel, by Gary. There was proof, Harold wrote. He had kept every piece of it. And there was a second sealed envelope, held by Douglas Webb, containing copies of everything. He wrote, "I want you to know something with complete certainty before you open that second envelope. I want you to know I never gave up. I tried every way I could think of, and I knew, in my bones, that someday the right door would open, and when it did, I wanted you to find everything I had saved waiting on the other side." And then he wrote the line, "You told her I didn't love her. I spent 22 years trying to prove you wrong through every door you locked." I read that sentence 4 times. Then I read the rest of the letter. Then I set it on the bedspread beside me, and I sat in the silence of a hotel room in Fort Collins, and I let 20 years rearrange themselves. It took a while. Then I picked up my phone and called Douglas Webb. I need to stop right here for just a moment before I tell you what was in the second envelope. Because right now you know what I knew sitting on that hotel bed. You know about the letter. You know about the private investigator. But you don't know what 34 pieces of paper look like when someone hands them to you. And you don't know what Gary did when he understood that the documentation existed. If you are not subscribed to Betrayal House yet, do that right now. Hit the bell. And if you're still with me, drop 34 letters in the comments. I will know exactly who made it this far. Because what happened in that conference room 10 days later? Nobody walked out the same. Gary called me at 7:45 the next morning. I was still in the hotel. I had barely slept. The letter was on the nightstand, and I had been watching the ceiling for the better part of an hour. He said, "Rachel, I know you're upset. Let's talk about this." I didn't respond immediately. He said, "Your grandfather, he wasn't well toward the end. He had people around him influencing things. Whatever he wrote in that letter, whatever that attorney has been saying to you." I said, "Did you cash the check he sent for my 18th birthday?" A pause. Not the pause of someone searching for a memory. The pause of someone calculating distance. He said, "Rachel, that was a long time ago. There were expenses, there were complications at the time." I hung up. Sandra called 12 minutes later. I let it go to voicemail. She left 4 minutes of audio. "We never wanted to hurt you. Your grandfather was a difficult man, and we were protecting you from his moods, from his way of doing things. We gave you everything. We were there. We were always there." I listened once. Then I called Diana Torres. Diana was a probate attorney in Denver. A colleague at my school had used her the previous year for a complicated estate dispute and described her as the kind of person who read legal documents the way librarians read collections. Slowly, completely, always looking for the thing someone didn't intend to leave visible. I laid out everything on the phone. The letter. The second sealed envelope I hadn't yet seen. The will reading in 10 days. The cashier's check. The private investigator's report Harold had referenced. Diana said, "Do you have anything in writing from your grandfather beyond the personal letter?" I said, "There's a second sealed document at Webb's office. He says it was deposited 2 years ago." She said, "Don't open it without me." 2 days after that conversation, a certified letter arrived from Gary and Sandra's attorney, a man named Briggs. They were filing a formal challenge to Harold's will on the grounds of diminished capacity and undue influence. The named parties responsible for supposedly manipulating Harold, Dorothy Reeves, his housekeeper of 11 years, and Rachel Hollis, who, as far as Gary and Sandra understood, had not spoken to Harold in over a decade. I forwarded the letter to Diana. Her response was 2 sentences. "Fantastic. They just handed us everything we need." Diana and I met at her office the following week. She had already spoken with Webb twice. The second sealed envelope, reviewed together with Diana and Webb present, as Harold had specified, contained the following: 34 letters, written by Harold between 1999 and 2021. Each one addressed to me at my parents' Fort Collins address, the address Harold had been given as mine, not the Denver address where I had actually lived for a decade. The envelopes had never been opened. 2 of them had been returned to Harold marked "declined," in handwriting that was not Harold's and not mine. A cashier's check stub for $5,000, made out to Rachel Hollis, dated 2 weeks before my 18th birthday, endorsed on the back by Gary Raymond Hollis. The full written report from Carla Santos, private investigator, dated 2019, signed and notarized. 22 pages. Documented evidence of intercepted correspondence spanning 20 years. And 3 neurological evaluation summaries from Harold's physician, dated within the past 2 years. Each one recorded full cognitive capacity. No dementia, no impairment, no diminishment of any kind. Diana laid everything out on her conference table in chronological order. I stood on one side of it and looked at what 22 years of someone refusing to give up looked like, physically, as a collection of paper. 34 letters. She slid one across to me. March 2003. Harold's handwriting, slightly younger looking than the letter Webb had given me. The envelope bore my parents' Fort Collins address. Stamped copy in red at an angle, because the originals were preserved in archival sleeves. Inside, "Happy spring, Rachel. I've been reading a lot lately. Mysteries, mostly. I remember you liked mysteries when you came to Thanksgiving. Have you read anything good? I'd love to know. Write me back when you can. Love, Grandpa Harold." I was 15 in March 2003. I would have answered that letter. I know I would have answered it. I called Dorothy Reeves that evening. She had a careful, steady voice, the kind developed by years of being the person in the room who holds things together. She told me she had worked for Harold for 11 years. She said he spoke about me constantly. He had photographs on his desk, she said. Pictures from when I was small. Images I couldn't even remember being taken. In the last year of his life, he would sit in his chair by the window in the afternoon light and say, "I just want to know she's okay. I just want to know she's doing all right." I asked why he hadn't tried to contact me directly in recent years, bypassing Gary and Sandra entirely. She was quiet for a moment. "He did try," she said. "Every time he did, something went wrong. Either there was no answer, or he was told you had said you didn't want to hear from him." After the private investigator confirmed what was happening, he stopped trying to go through them. He said, she paused again. He said, "Dorothy, I'm going to do this the right way. I'm going to make absolutely sure she knows, when it counts." She paused. "I think he meant the will." I thanked her. After I hung up, I sat in my car in the parking lot for a long time before I could drive. Then I went home and I opened my filing cabinet and I got to work. I cross-referenced the check stub against my own financial records from that year. Nothing had ever been deposited on my behalf. I contacted the post office in Fort Collins and confirmed the delivery window for mail to my parents' address. I made a spreadsheet, letter date, subject, confirmed non-delivery, cross-reference. I have a system for this. I have always had a system for this. I scanned everything. I built a folder. Diana Torres was not the kind of attorney who moved at half speed. By the time we met at her office 1 week before the will reading, she had reviewed everything twice and identified what she called a gift in Harold's documentation that she had rarely seen, executed this cleanly outside of corporate litigation. Harold had anticipated a challenge. He had built his case the way a developer builds a foundation, before the house, before the walls, before anything visible was placed on top. He had included in the will itself a provision. Any party who contested the will without legal standing would be required to pay the opposing party's legal fees in full. Harold had been a property developer for 30 years. He knew a contract. Diana laid it all out on her conference table. 34 letters in archival sleeves. Carla Santos's PI report with her signature on every page. The cashier's check stub. 3 neurological evaluations. Dorothy's written witness statement. She had agreed to provide one without hesitation, said it was the least she could do. Diana said, "The will is ironclad. The grounds for their contest don't exist. The question is how you want to handle the presentation." I said, "What are my options?" "Quiet," she said. "We submit the documentation before the reading. The contest gets dropped. Everyone goes home with their dignity technically intact. Or, in the room. You give them the moment where they understand what Harold did and what they couldn't stop." I thought about the text message. 2 sentences. No call. I thought about 34 letters in a Fort Collins filing cabinet. I thought about a brass pocket watch and a door that was closed on me before I could step through it. I said, "I want it in the room." Diana smiled, small and precise. "Then let's be ready," she said. I was ready. I had been ready, in ways I didn't yet understand, for a very long time. The morning of the reading, I arrived 9 minutes early. I wore a dark blazer over a plain white shirt. I carried my canvas bag, a little worn at the strap. Inside, my phone, a notepad, a pen, and nothing I didn't need. The conference room was on the 14th floor. It smelled like printer paper and old coffee. Douglas Webb was already there, arranging documents in the order he had clearly planned carefully. Diana arrived 2 minutes after me and placed her briefcase at my side of the table without a word. Gary and Sandra arrived with Briggs 4 minutes after that. Gary was in the pressed button-down. Sandra had the pearl earrings. Gary looked at me across the table. I looked back at him. He still looked calm. Douglas Webb cleared his throat. He read the date of execution, the witnesses, the notarization details. He read it all the way through before he got to the numbers. And his voice was the same at the end as it was at the beginning, even unhurried, giving no advance indication of what was about to land in the room. The estate, $40 million. Gary and Sandra Hollis, 0. Rachel Hollis, primary beneficiary, full estate. Plus a named charitable trust, the Harold R. Hollis Reading Fund, established to provide grants to underfunded school libraries across the state of Colorado. Named in honor of my granddaughter Rachel, Webb read, who told me once, when she was a little girl, that she wanted to be a librarian. I hadn't known that was in there. I had to breathe through it carefully. Gary's face went through the initial fracture, that loose jaw moment, and then immediately into something harder. Reconstruction. He looked at Briggs, and Briggs was already leaning forward with his legal pad when Diana slid the package across the table. She placed it there quietly. Not a slam, not a performance. Just, here it is. "Before you complete that objection," she said, "you'll want to review what you're holding." Briggs opened the package. He turned the first page, the second, the third. I watched his face go through 3 separate expressions in about 15 seconds. He turned to the back. He saw the neurological evaluations. He set it down. Gary said, "What is that?" Diana said, 34 letters written by Harold Hollis, addressed to your daughter, intercepted at your Fort Collins address between 1999 and 2021. A cashier's check stub for $5,000, endorsed by Gary Raymond Hollis, for a check made out to Rachel for her 18th birthday. A private investigator's full report documenting 22 years of documented correspondence interference. And 3 neurological evaluations from Harold's physician confirming full cognitive capacity across the past 2 years. She paused. "Mr. Hollis, your father was not diminished. He was meticulous." Gary said, "He was confused about a lot of things near the end." His voice was very quiet when he said it. Douglas Webb said, "Mr. Hollis, your father included a personal statement in the will to be read aloud at this proceeding. I'd like to read it now." The room went still. Webb found the page. He read, "You told her I didn't love her. I spent 22 years trying to prove you wrong through every door you locked. I want her to hear this clearly, in whatever room she is sitting in when these words are read. I never stopped. I kept every letter. I kept every record. I documented every attempt and every obstacle because I knew, with a certainty I cannot explain except to say that I am her grandfather, and I knew her from the moment she was born, that one day she would need to see it. And I wanted her to understand that the story she was told about me was not true. It was never true. I loved her from the first day I held her. I love her still. I am sorry it took this to reach her. I am sorry I did not find a better way sooner. But I want her to have everything. Not because it will fix the time that was taken. Nothing will fix that. But because I want her to know, beyond any possible doubt, what she was worth to me." Sandra was crying quietly. Gary's hands were flat on the table. Briggs said very quietly to Gary, "I think we need to step out." Gary didn't say anything. He pushed back his chair. He stood. He did not look at me. Sandra followed. The door closed behind them. Webb set the papers down. Diana looked at me. I looked at the door. That was the second where everything Harold had kept for 22 years finally arrived where it was supposed to be. The will contest was formally withdrawn the following morning. Briggs filed the paperwork himself. Per the anti-contest clause Harold had written into the will, Gary and Sandra were ordered to pay my legal fees in full. Diana submitted the invoice at the end of the week. It was a substantial number. I did not negotiate it down. Dorothy Reeves received $200,000 from Harold's estate, with a note attached that read, "For being the person who made sure I was never truly alone. I called her when I heard. She cried. I did too." Gary stopped calling after the second week. He sent one text, brief, that said only, "I hope you know we did what we thought was right." I did not respond to it. Sandra sent an email. One email, 3 paragraphs, carefully worded. She sent it 3 weeks after the reading. I received it. I did not open it for 6 months. When I finally read it, late on a Sunday evening with a cup of tea going cold on my desk, it contained no apology. 3 paragraphs of explanation, of context, of justification for decisions made across 2 decades. The word sorry appeared once, in the phrase, "I'm sorry you feel that way." I wrote back a single sentence. "I'll be in touch when I'm ready." I have not yet been ready. The Harold R. Hollis Reading Fund disbursed its first round of grants 8 months after the will was settled. 12 schools across Colorado, 3 of them in Denver. New libraries, new books, librarian training stipends, reading programs for students whose first language was not English. My name is on the founding documents as a trustee. Harold made sure of that. He made sure of many things in the end. All of them quiet. All of them built to outlast him. I went back to Denver 2 weeks after the reading. Back to the school, back to the library, back to the students who needed someone to show them that the thing they were looking for usually already existed somewhere, waiting to be found. I sat down at my desk the first morning back, and I unpacked my bag, and at the bottom of it, underneath my notebook and my phone charger, I found the folder Diana had given me, copies of Harold's 34 letters. I took out the shortest one. March 2003. The word copy stamped at an angle across the upper corner in red. Inside, Harold's handwriting. "Happy spring, Rachel. I've been reading a lot lately, mysteries mostly. I remember you liked mysteries at Thanksgiving. Have you read anything good? I'd love to know. Write me back when you can. Love, Grandpa Harold." I had it framed. Simple dark wood, clean matting, nothing elaborate. It hangs on the wall beside my desk at school, at just about the height that a 10-year-old's eyes land when they walk past. The kids ask about it sometimes. What does it say? Who wrote it? I tell them it's a letter from my grandfather. They ask what it says. I say, he says to read good books. That is what it says. But here's the thing I understand now that I could not have understood at 12, sitting on that footstool in Harold's living room, watching a door close before I could step through it. Being unseen is almost never a fact about you. It is almost always a project. Someone built it. Someone decided over and over and over years, that your smallness was worth something to them, that keeping you at a distance paid something back. And they were wrong. They were wrong about the distance, wrong about the cost, wrong about how permanent it was. Harold knew that. He spent 22 years building proof in the opposite direction. 34 letters, a private investigator, 3 neurological evaluations, a will designed with the precision of someone who understood that documents outlast people and that love, properly preserved, can find its way through every door it was kept from. It found me. It arrived, exactly as he intended, in a windowless conference room on the 14th floor of a building in downtown Denver, in front of the people who had built the distance, on a morning when the smell of old coffee and printer paper, was the backdrop for the best thing that had ever been said about me in a room I was allowed to be in. I keep things now. I kept things before. Files, records, the old photo of Harold and me from when I was small, the birthday cards he sent every year, the grant applications, the lease agreements. But now I understand what keeping things is actually for. It isn't about distrust. It isn't about waiting for something to go wrong. It is about believing that what is true is worth preserving until the right moment to show it. Harold believed that about me. I believe that about every kid who walks into my library and sits down with a book in their lap and disappears into it, away from whatever is loud and difficult and outside. I see them. I remember being them. And I know that being overlooked by the people who were supposed to see you is not a life sentence. It is someone else's decision. And other people's decisions can be overturned. Ask Douglas Webb. Ask Harold Raymond Hollis. Ask the 34 letters on my wall. If this story made you feel seen, if you have ever been told you were not loved by someone who actually loved you most, I want you to leave something in the comments. Not for me. For the next person who finds this video at 2 a.m. and needs to know they are not the only one. Comment below. Share this with someone who needs it today. Subscribe to Betrayal House so you don't miss the next story. I'll see you there.